Hello, my name is Duncan McAdams. I've been running this list for about 2 years. This specific list, the blue variant, I've been running for about half a year, maybe a little longer, maybe a little less. Um, I debuted it at Dallas a number of months ago, and I'm going back there. And because of that, I've made a couple of changes, and I've had incentive to sort of like try to optimize it recently. And I think this is currently one or two cards off the optimal hardened scales build, and I like to talk about it. This you can call this a deck primer, or more an explanation as to my choices. But I think this will be a good resource for people maybe getting into hardened scales or who want to specifically know my choices, or maybe people trying to refine their own lists. Uh, so to start, the deck itself, I'm gonna assume the people that are watching this are ones that already know how hardened scales the deck works. But essentially, you have scales, and you have Ozolith. Both of these essentially double your amount of +1/+1 counters. I call those enablers. And then you have your payoffs, which are things like Walking Ballista and Hangerback Walker, which have really good effects when they have lots of counters on them. You can distribute these counters with Ravager, which is also sort of a payoff. And you can essentially double, triple, quadruple all your counters to make a really big ward guy, or to make a really big lethal Inkmoth Nexus, or make a really big lethal Walker or Ballista, etc., etc. There's a couple of ways people go about it. Most of the people run green-red, which is not really red. It's basically just mono green. Because you can tell most of the deck is entirely colorless. But the red splash for Zabaz's red ability, which looks really bad, destroy target artifact you control, was actually incredibly relevant. It turns him into a little bit of a small Arcbound Ravager, and that's really important to sort of higher your density of payoffs. So maybe your Zabaz has a couple counters on it. You can move him to your Walker. Your Walker gets big. You can destroy your Walker with him. Whatever. You get the idea. So to splash blue, there's also the white version, which I think is not as good right now. It splashes for Esper Sentinel. It's not really a splash for Zabaz's white ability. His white ability comes up very not that often. Not that it's useless. It comes up maybe one in every 20 games, maybe a little less. But when it's good, it's very good, and it's not like irrelevant text. So to run blue, you have to sacrifice a couple of red sources, not many, and debatably utility, but not really, because like you lose like Llanowar Reborn, but no one's running Llanowar Reborn. The card's not very up to par anymore. And in exchange for losing a few red sources and losing a little bit of consistency in your mana, mainly just the red, but also a little bit in the green. I'll talk about that later. You get Otawara in your mana base, really big. You get Spellbomb in your main deck, which is a really big deal for decks like Hammer, decks like Titan, decks like Murktide, anything that puts Archon in play. And the big one is that you get Metallic Rebuke in the board, or any sort of counterspell in the board. It's really important, at least in the meta, how it is in the last like year or so, where Cascade is a massive, massive chunk in the meta. And being able to counter their Cascade spell a lot of the times means that they lose the game. Most of these Cascade decks are completely dysfunctional without resolving their spell. Nowadays, Rhinos is Yorion variants, which run like Solitudes and Omnaths and stuff, but that game plan is way too slow against us, and we essentially just win if they can't put their fast clock into play. I'm currently on Nyx, and I'll explain that when I get to the sideboard, but basically I want to talk about the mana first, because I think the mana is really interesting. Not a lot of people know how to build it well. For blue, I recommend 10 blue sources plus Drum. I'll get to why Drum is important later. But I think 10 blue sources is a really good number. You don't need the blue until later game. So you don't really have to have it as a turn 1 source. So things like Spire of Industry and Springleaf Drum completely count, so 10 to 11. I run currently 7 red sources. You can be up on red sources. I think if you did, you would have to cut the 1 colorless land. I think you have room for about 9 colorless lands in these kind of lists. In green-red, maybe you have room for 10, if you're generous. But not a lot of people are doing that, and maybe that's fine. It also counts as like a third of a colored source, right? It'll be in your hand, in your opener, some percentage of the time, and it'll be in your on the draw. You'll be on the draw about half the time. I call it like a third of a colored source. It's always rough numbers, but it doesn't really affect the final count that much. I'm on 12 green sources, 8 of which are not Spire, which is notable because Spire only counts for green on turn 1 if you have a 0 drop, which is not incredibly unoften. But what I do is I count these as halves, because I'm running Bobble to sort of facilitate that a little bit. So I call this 10. That gives you a 75% chance to have green on turn 1, which it actually is somewhat low. But to have green on turn 2 is something like an 82% chance if you're counting drum. It might be a little higher than like 83. And at any point in the game to have green, it's significantly higher. And those numbers are completely fine. If you're looking just to cast Hardened Scales at any point. Casting on turn 1 is ideal, but you gain a little, like 10 percentage points otherwise. The green-red version has a little bit more consistency with this, but this doesn't come up as often as you'd think. Although, to say it doesn't come up at all, I think would be disingenuous, so I wanted to point that out. So, 12 green sources, sort of, 10 blue sources, sort of, and then 7 red sources. I believe 1, 2, I can't count. 6, 7. Yeah, none of those are including drum. So drum is the 8th red source, the 13th green source, the 11th blue source. And sort of, because drum is in the deck, you can kind of count Urza's Saga as a colored source, which I have done in the past. I think it counts significantly well for a red source. I think you can count it for a blue source. It kind of doesn't really count as a green source, but it can be at any point you need it. So really your numbers will always probably work out at some point in the game. The specific cards, I think 2 Boseiju is the correct number. 2 at the point, with 2 in the deck, your chances of drawing both of them, and to have drawing both of them be a bad enough thing to lose you the game, is something like 1 in every 44 games, which is a very low number, and the chances, the games that you want to have the Boseiju, and that's super relevant to have and super, super powerful, is a lot more than 1 in 44. I would definitely run 2. I think 3 is stretching it, even with Leyline Binding being on the upswing right now. I would definitely play 2 Boseiju exactly. 1 Botanical Sanctum. So the Botanical Sanctum Yavimaya Coast split, I have about 3 slots for that. You can run 2 Botanical Sanctum. It is completely fine. I prefer to have minimal chance of just losing the game, because if like, your 4th land drop is extremely important because it lets you go double 2-drop, because you have 16 2-drops, right? Sometimes you can play these X's for 4, but you don't do that very often. Going double 2-drop is extremely important. If this Botanical Sanctum comes in tapped on that turn, a lot of times you're going to be way behind on tempo. It doesn't come up basically ever with 1. It comes up very, very rarely with 2. If I was on Academy Ruins instead of Gemstone Cavern, which I used to be when Blue-White Control was big in the meta, which I don't think you should be right now, I would probably be on 2 Botanical Sanctum, because tapping your blue multiple times and not taking pain from it is really important. But Yavimaya Coast is, for all intents and purposes, Botanical Sanctum in every other way. I am running no basic lands, because basic lands are basically only relevant if you get like Ghost Quartered, Path to Exiled, Assassin's Trophy. Depending on your local meta, I think it's fine to run basics. I think in an open meta, like if you're going to a big tournament, I think it's definitely a waste of space and you're missing out on color sources when you're running basics. But you still need 2 Boseiju fetchables, because Boseiju comes up a lot. My Boseiju fetchables are Breeding Pool and Stomping Ground, so if you need to, you can fetch the red source for Zabaz if you get Boseiju'd. If you need to, you can fetch the blue source for Rebuke, which will come up a lot. The Fiery Islet looks weird. You probably ask why it's not Waterlogged Grove. And the reason is because I don't think you can count Waterlogged Grove as a green source, since to play Scales, you want it on turn 1. And if you play Waterlogged Grove on turn 1, you're going to end up taking like 5 points of ping damage. Whereas the Fiery Islet doesn't have to be played turn 1 ever, because you'll never need blue on 1, you'll never need red on 1. So I much prefer the Fiery Islet, you'll end up taking less damage overall. And it's not like I'm losing out on a green source, it's just that instead of, like, I would split up the lands to where the colors would be the same, but I would have a different canopy land in there. So don't think of it as I'm running 1 less green source, you should think of it as I'm distributing the pips differently. There's 1 colorless source in the deck after Urza's Saga and Inkmoth, and you can run a number of different things in this slot. I've seen people run Blinkmoth, you can run Roadside Reliquary is a very good one. Academy Ruins in blue is very good. I only like that if blue-white's really big in the format. I think right now Gemstone Cavern is extremely powerful, whereas about 1 in 15 games you'll get to put this thing into play, and you'll get to go either like turn 1 Patchwork Automaton, which against Murktide is nigh unbeatable, it's like pretty close to unbeatable. Or you could go turn 2 Saga Activation, which is extremely powerful. Like a lot of decks, like again, Murktide basically cannot beat that start. You can go things like turn 1 Hardened Scales plus Ozolith, extremely powerful. Turn 1 Walker, extremely powerful. Just crazy, crazy stuff that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. You have to exile the card from your hand, which is relevant. It comes up, and knowing what to exile is actually extremely difficult. But a lot of times that tempo advantage is just unbeatable for a lot of decks. The slot, so the way I've the pips slotted up, you have about one green red source slot, not including the stomping ground. Grove of the Burnwells is the best one. It has random percentage points against Death Shadow, which you think is like dumb and never comes up, but it actually comes up. At the RCQ I won to qualify for Atlanta, I got to kill two Death Shadows with the same activation, and I was winning that game anyway. But damn, bro, that was so good. Inkmoth Nexus, you always have to play 4, obviously. I'm not going to go over that because I'm going to assume you guys have some knowledge of the deck. But Inkmoth Nexus is extremely powerful. It's one of your payoffs, and you'll be able to kill with it. The one Otawara is so much better than people give it credit for. I think it's a big reason to play blue. They have a Leyline out, Leyline in the Void that's preventing your modular triggers from happening. You can end the turn Otawara. On your turn, kill people. I've done that a ton. You can bounce Archons. You can bounce hammered creatures. This card is like insane utility for just being a land, and it really mitigates your flooding. That's a big thing I like with Hardened Scales, is that a lot of times your flooding will not matter because your land utility is so powerful. And I think a lot of people running mana bases that are so laser focused on just getting their colors are missing out a lot on what the deck does. Because you'll draw like 6 lands, and for most decks it's like game over. For this deck it's like, okay, well I have a Nature's Claim, and I have an Inkmoth, and I have an Urza Saga, and I have an Otawara, and I have blah 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 blah. Fire Outlet drawing card extremely powerful. I wouldn't play more than 1 Canopy land, by the way. I didn't go over that. I think 2 gets to the point where your deck probably doesn't too much damage to you on average, and you're going to be forced to play them early. But 1 is like perfect. You'll almost never have problems. Anyway, Spire of Industry. You really want it in these non-green red versions. 1, because the Zabaz fly ability, it rarely comes up, but when it does come up, having Spire is really good. It adds to your red source count. It's just like, it adds to all your colors really conveniently, and you probably want 4. I'd probably play like 6 if I could. I don't know if I'd play more than that, but 4 is definitely where you want to be. And finally, obviously, Urza Saga. You have to play 4 of them. This card is broken. It's extremely powerful. You have weird play patterns with it. I play this card on 1 very often with this deck. It's an enabler, because it'll turn into your Ozlith, it'll turn into your Zabaz, it'll turn into your Springleaf Drum to ramp you 1. If you play Urza Saga on 2, is it? Yeah, on 2, on turn 4, wait, I fucked that up. If you play it on turn 3, or on turn 1, if you play Urza Saga on turn 1, if you get Springleaf Drum, you'll have 4 mana on turn 3, which sets up a lot of turn 3 kills. I do that very often, especially in like local metas where people are playing like less removally decks, right? You're playing against a guy on Affinity, you can actually probably turn 3 kill him like somewhat often if you mulligan for it. But this card's extremely powerful. You have to know kind of what your opponent's doing to know how to use it, but it's worth noting that you should do on 1 every once in a while. That's the mana base. You should play 23 lands if you're on Baubles. If you're not on Baubles, which most people are not, I think you should run 24. I think a lot of people are getting a little too dicey with their 23. Like I said, being able to flood and still having a lot of shit to do is one of the best things that this deck does. And I think having 24 lands, like, to guarantee you hit 4 on 4, not guarantee, but to make it likely you hit 4 on 4, is really, really important. Missing land drops is a big L in this deck, because it's so mana hungry. You play 16 2-drops, you play all these 1-drops. You want to activate Zabaz, you want to hold up for Relic of Progenitus, you want to hold blah 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 blah. You have so much to do with your mana. And like, you want to activate Walking Ballista, and there's so many turns where you're like, if I draw a land, I am so far ahead here. So many turns where you say that. If you're not running Bauble, you should play 24 lands. If you are on Bauble, you can run 23. But honestly, I've played 24 in this version, and I thought it was really good. Although I think the cuts are tighter nowadays, now that Patchwork is a mainstay. Anyway, the weirdest part of this list, I wouldn't say weirdest, but something people ask about a lot, is Mishra's Bauble. Mishra's Bauble has a bunch of small synergies. It's by no means necessary to play in the deck, although I think it's optimal. It has a bunch of small synergies. So, first, it makes your Spires tap for green on 1. Extremely important. The other obvious one is that it makes your Patchworks bigger, faster. It makes your Ravagers bigger, faster. So, you'll have a lot of times where your opponent plays like a Ragavan, and, I don't know, maybe you're on the play, or even if you're on the draw, you go like Scales Automaton, and you're like, damn, I'm going to have to take the hit from this Ragavan because my Tauntaun's a 1-1, and my Tauntaun is worth a lot more than this Ragavan is. You have your Bauble, you can go Automaton Bauble, it's a 3-3, you're now able to block and you won't feel stupid about it. You can do a Jar too, of course. Having the zeros is really important for that. Ravagers is a similar story. If you have Scales out and you want to dodge Lightning Bolt or an Unholy Heat with no Delirium, having that 0 drop out early lets you play it and feel a lot safer about it. It basically just speeds up your plays a lot, which I think is really important. It also makes your rebukes a lot smoother to cast because they have that improvise. This comes up a lot. I had this come up a lot earlier in like older versions of Rhinos, where they'd go, you're on the draw, and they go, turn 2, ice your land, and you're like, shit, I can't cast my Metallic Rebuke now. This sucks, because you only had so many artifacts to play. Blah blah blah. Now with the jars, or with the baubles, it makes it a lot more smooth. Just a bunch of little synergies that add up extremely. In worst case, you just cycle it. I probably keep it in play about half the time and draw with it about half the time. It's pretty 50-50. Just having a 0-mana artifact is extremely powerful. But late game, it's also a redraw. You'll have moments where you top deck it and feel really dumb. But those times do not come up as often as the times where Bauble makes your draw so much more powerful and explosive. I would definitely play Bauble. I like 6/0 drops. I would not play 4 Welding Jar right now. A lot of the removal in the meta is exile based, and running 4 jars makes it to where it's a lot more likely you're gonna have a bunch of these dead draws in the matchups where jar's not very good. A lot of times drawing 1 jar is fine because you just have the synergies with like Patchy, you eat it to Ravager, blah blah blah. But once you draw 2, you're in a pretty bad spot. Aether Spellbomb is an extremely good one of, and half the reason to play blue. The other half is Rebuke plus little things. Being able to fetch it and have an extremely good time against Hammer. Against Hammer, Cauldra is like our worst fear. We can deal with all their stuff with removal, blah blah blah. But with Cauldra, they just play it, equip a Hammer, and there's nothing we can do about it. Well, now we have Aether Spellbomb, sometimes Auto Aura. But we can just fetch Aether Spellbomb off of Urza Saga, bounce it, now you're way ahead, especially if they equipped a Hammer to it. It's extremely powerful. I don't draw with it very often. I feel like most of the time when you draw it, you just use the bounce effect for tempo, which I've done a lot, or to get a little bit of damage in, make their next turn a little bit more awkward. It comes up a lot. You do board out Spellbomb a lot, but having it in the main deck shores up a lot of your matchups, and drawing it is never that bad. 2-mana redraw is pretty taxing, but late game it's basically a non-issue, so I like it. Ancient Stirrings is a weird filter. We have like a little bit of filler in the deck, where if they print like one more really powerful threat, I think Stirrings will be very good, or be not as good. I think you'll end up cutting it. But for now, I like Stirrings. It makes your mana a little more smooth. A lot of times it just grabs Saga or Ravager or some powerful thing. It's your best top deck late game, and it's good to have in the meantime. It's powerful, and I think there's not many good cards that replace it, and it makes your threat density a little higher, which I enjoy. Harnscale's Ozolith, blah, blah, blah. The Springleaf Drum is extremely important. Not running Springleaf Drum is madness. It makes it to where your 2-mana Urza Saga hands are actually keepable. Drawing it is better than a land most of the time. And just that tempo play of just fetching up your drum so you can play one more card this turn is so powerful, and not a lot of people do it. I really appreciate having drum. It's a red source when you need it to be. It's a white source when you need it to be. It's that extra mana. It turns your sagas into rituals. It is just so good, and people that are not playing this are really missing out. 3 Ozolith over 2 Ozolith. I've seen people even play 1 Ozolith. I dislike that. The Ozolith, this deck basically does not function without an enabler. And your Urza Saga does not always count as an enabler. So you'll think, well, Urza Saga is just going to fetch my Ozolith anyway. And that's true, but it's going to do it, turns after you want it. Being able to play your enabler on 1 against so many decks is such an important effect that you need 3 of it. That extra percentage points for drawing an enabler in your opener is so important that I would definitely run 3 Ozolith. If you draw multiple, which doesn't happen as often as you think it would, it honestly ends up being fine. A lot of times it gets removed, and worst case you sack it to Ravager and you don't feel that bad about it. It ends up being like a generic artifact, which is not good, but it's fine. Ozolith is extremely powerful, and you should run as many as is not ludicrous. I think 4 is too many, of course. Although I've tried it, it's kind of bad though. You should run 3 Ozolith. It makes your deck extremely consistent, and running 2 I think just dilutes the power of your opening hands too much. It's really hard to keep a hand without an enabler in this deck. Okay, so basically 4 Ballista, 4 Ravager, 4 Zabaz is standard. You basically cannot run less than 4 of any of these, or you're a madman. I've seen people run 3 Hangerback. I've run 3 Hangerback for a while. I think it's incorrect. I think the notion that this card is bad against exile effects and Archmage's Charm is wrong. Because, you think, well, it gets 1 for 1 at that point. But also, you have your 8 sack outlets, kind of 12, kind of a little more than that. And you just destroy it, and they Archmage Charm, and then you sack it, and then they just use 3 mana to force you to sack something you were going to sack eventually anyway, and you're extremely ahead. Same goes for like Solitude. If they try to Solitude it, whatever. If they Leyline Binding it, it feels kind of bad. You sacrifice it, you get your sick value. Most of the decks that are trying to do that against you can have a really hard time beating a couple 1/1s. I would never go down on walkers, especially in sideboarding. I don't cut any of these cards, except I trim Zabaz sometimes, because having 4 is not always necessary. And you can cut Patchy in a lot of matchups. Patchy, I think, should be a 4 of right now. It's extremely powerful. Most of the decks in the format are very like interaction heavy, and they get bottlenecked on their mana. Like, they're really clunky. Decks like Creativity, decks like... saying Murktide's clunky is sort of an exaggeration, but decks like Shadow, Murktide, Creativity, Rhinos have a really, really hard time beating around this ward too, especially Murktide. If Murktide, you have Jar, if you go turn 1 Scales, Automaton, Jar, I swear that matchup, you are now like 90% to win that matchup. It is extremely hard to lose from that position. They have to go pay 3 to bolt it on that turn, and then you Jar it, and then you play 2 more things, and it is now impossible to remove from the battlefield without an EE. That will happen every once in a while. Sometimes they bring in Hurkyl's Recall too, but those are bad lists. They usually just run that if they have the extra slot. But Patchwork is extremely hard for them to deal with. It's so game-winning that even though it's completely worthless against decks like Titan, Hammer, Living End, I think you still want 4 of them. You can just board them out, and against decks like that, I have dead cards in my hand at the end of the game most games. You just don't play it, and it ends up being fine. The sideboard... I think my sideboards are always a little weird, and I kind of like them that way. I like consistency in my sideboard. You can probably see that, because I'm running 5 Nature's Claim effects, and I'm running 5 Counterspell effects. I sort of like to change my game plan post board. So against decks like Hammer, I'll do it for instance. Your play pattern against them every single game is going to be remove their first creature. That's either going to be with Spellbomb, one of your Nature's Claims, or with your Pongify, or with your Boseiju. Not really with Auto War because it's expensive, but one of those. You remove their first creature. Now they're slow. After that point, you either set up a big Walking Ballista, or you set up some sort of kill with the rest of your cards, and then you win the game. Either that, or you get into a grind fest, and you have far more removal than them. You have your way to deal with their Cauldron, which is how they win the grind fest. You have 2 ways to deal with it. And after that, it's very hard for them to beat you. Hammer is a good matchup, especially if you're like ready for it. You just have so much removal for their stuff, and they have a very hard time getting around it. It's also really hard to justify bringing in Blacksmith Skill against you. It'll be dead most of the time in most matchups, and they're just unprepared for it. A similar thing goes for Rebuke. When you're playing against Cascade decks, your Rebukes are extremely powerful. If you counter their Cascade spell, the game basically ends. Against Living End, you counter their Cascade spell, you just Time Walk them for 1 mana, and a lot of times you'll be able to kill them on the backswing. Or you counter their Force of Vigor, or you counter their whatever you need to. A lot of times countering Force of Vigor is an amazing side effect for Metallic Rebuke. That's the case for Rhinos. Against Rhinos, you get to counter any of their big stuff that hits you really hard, like their 0 mana Solitude, their 0 mana Force of Vigor, or just their win condition, the Rhinos. I say that in quotes. They have a couple ways to beat you. That's kind of why I like Nyx. So I've been experimenting with the 5th counterspell. I think Flusterstorm is bad, because most of the time Flusterstorm is just Spell Pierce, and Spell Pierce is bad, although it doesn't hit as much. I think Invasive Surgery is better. It hits Creativity straight up, it hits all the Cascade spells, but it's a little too narrow against the Cascade decks, I think, because you're not able to hit the Force of Vigor, which I think is extremely important to have that multi-varied sort of counterspell. Rebuke hits everything. I would never play less than 4 Rebuke. If I could, I'd probably play 5. I'd consider 6, but I think the 6th one would have to be something else. Being able to counter that effect is really powerful, and that's sort of your new game plan. You deal with their first thing, and then you beat them with your plan. Against Living End, you bring in Nyx, 2 Relics, Hearse, 4 Rebukes. And you have this extremely powerful like lock plan, and now they have to deal with whatever threat you put out. And even if they do, you have your Ozlith, you have your Inkmoth Nexus, you have your Ravager, you have your Zabaz, you have your Walker, which are all extremely sticky against their game plan. It's very powerful. I prefer 2 relics. I like the 2nd relic over the first Soul Guide Lantern, because even though 0 mana Exile is very relevant. Being able to draw a card and exile is a lot more relevant. I have it come up a lot where you just need the one extra card against decks like that. Especially when you're bringing your relics versus decks like Murktide, that card is super important, and Soul Guide will be dead a lot more often than that. Hearse is like my flex slot. I don't know. I think it maybe could be Animation Module, which will probably only come in for Rakdos Scam. I think the Scam matchup's going to be in Dallas a lot, and I kind of want to shore up for it. But Hearse is sort of like to hedge against the matchups you're already good against, like Murktide, Shadow, I don't know, Scam, whatnot, things like that. And it sort of just like buffs up your good matchup already. And I kind of like that sort of effect. That's kind of why Pongify's in here. Pongify's great against like Titan and Hammer, but it also gives you that extra edge against Murktide, where it beats Archmage's Charm in like a way they don't expect, and it kills their Murktide, obviously. A big thing with Rebuke, a big thing with like counter spells in this deck, is it's sort of the Hardened Scales effect in general, where when you kill people, a lot of times they're going to be unfamiliar with what you're doing, and it will be a complete surprise to them. They'll often play in ways to where you'll be able to kill them because they're not familiar with your lines. It'll happen a lot. And the same thing goes for Counterspell. Nobody in the entire world is going to be playing against Counterspell if they know they're against Hardened Scales. Especially if you just have a Spire of Industry untapped. You have this land untapped. No one in the world is going to play around Metallic Rebuke. And you can get away with a lot of stuff because of that. They'll throw out their Shardless Agent instead of their instant speed one Cascade spell against you. Because they're like, what are they going to do about it? I should do it now. You rebuke them, the game basically ends. It's really powerful to have that edge of surprise. And Scales sort of can get away with that, especially if it's an off version of Scales like this that not a lot of people are familiar with. Finally, Needle. Needle you just put in every Saga board. It's not very interesting. But I do specifically like it nowadays because I think Breach is on the upswing. Obviously, right? Because a lot of people have been winning with it. But that is sort of an overview of my list. I probably missed a lot of things, a lot of questions that aren't usually asked. But I try to go over all the deck choices, especially the mana base, because I think the mana base is particularly interesting. And it's a thing not a lot of people do right, at least from what I've seen. I think sideboards are also quite bad. Like, I don't like Damping Sphere, because you're already good against Tron, and there's better cards if you want to hedge for Titan. Torpor Orb is bad. It's not good against 4-color, so why are you bringing it in? Void Mirror right now is not very playable. It used to be amazing, but now that Rhinos is running 4 Leyline Binding, plus Teferi, plus whatever else, they actually have enough ways to deal with it that you're not very happy to bring it in, even though it beats Force of Vigor. I was very fond of Void Mirror because of that, because it beat Force of Vigor. But Chalice is, like, in the same sort of boat. It doesn't even stop Force of Vigor, so it just gets Force of Vigor, and you feel like an idiot. But, oh, that's my deck. That's my reasoning for running it. I might change the Hearse in the time between now and the 2 weeks when I run my event. But I wanted to make this real quick and see, I don't know, if just anyone was interested in hearing me do these little videos about what I'm running. I hope y'all enjoyed it.